Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Any political society that wants to survive has to limit and regulate the killing of some of its members by others. The most basic good that the governed expect of their government is security against unpredictable and unjust violence, because without that, little else is going to flourish. Nevertheless, the regulation of killing by the state is entirely compatible with kinds and levels of killing that most of us would find objectionable, even abhorrent. Roman law gave fathers the right to kill their own children. Historically, European law gave the state the right to kill certain kinds of criminal, something that now repels most Europeans. And for sure, the laws of a number of states in the USA still permit the imposition of the death penalty, but I very much doubt that many Americans today would support the execution of those convicted of theft or Roman Catholicism or atheism. The regulation of killing within a society can still permit a lot of killing. Political society requires the control of killing. Humanist political society seeks not merely control, but minimization. Societies that place a very high value on the lives of human individuals will want to discourage killing as far as possible and to restrict it to what's absolutely necessary. So, under the influence of biblical monotheism, with its unusually exalted view of the status of humans, ancient Jewish society sought to limit and moderate vengeance. Thus, after Cain had committed the original murder by killing his brother Abel, the 4th chapter of the Bible's first book tells us that Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me." Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Note, the mark of Cain is intended to protect a murderer against random vengeance. And when the Mosaic law enjoined life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe, it's generally understood that it was limiting vengeance to what's proportionate. For one life taken, one other, no more. Then, through the life and teaching of Jesus, this Jewish tradition of restraint upon killing is intensified in early Christianity by injunctions not to retaliate, to love one's enemies, and return good for evil. Accordingly, one of the effects of the Christianization of the Roman Empire in the course of the 4th century AD was the outlawing of infanticide in the year 374. Until that point, Roman fathers had the right to kill their children, even as adults, for such misdemeanors as failing to wear a veil in public. And when St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, wrote his City of God in the 2nd and 3rd decade of the 400s, we find suicide condemned and the use of lethal force subjected to the requirements of love. Any political society will strive to control killing, but a humanist political society will strive to minimize it. Maybe I should just clarify here. I believe in Christian or religious humanism. Oftentimes, religion and humanism are contraposed as alternatives. My view is that humanism need not be secular, and indeed would be better off if it weren't secular. Minimization of killing is not the same as abolition. Although Christian humanist civilization has given rise to a persistent pacifist tradition which abjures all deliberate lethal violence, its mainstream has always accepted that it might be permissible to kill under certain circumstances, certainly when necessary to protect the innocent from serious injury or in defense of the common good, but also more reluctantly when necessary in proportionate self-defense. Except in the case of self-defense, all permissible killing is reserved to agents of public authority, That's to say, those who bear responsibility for maintaining law and order by curbing and punishing crime. Section 2, Doctors and Killing. I should just say, when I say doctors, sometimes I mean healthcare professionals. My wife, who's a nurse, would not let me get away with imagining that doctors are the only ones who do healthcare. So if what I say applies to you and you're not a doctor, please feel free. Doctors and other healthcare professionals are neither policemen, nor hangmen, nor soldiers. Their role is not that of maintaining law and order, of protecting the innocent against injury, or of punishing the guilty. So they're not authorized to kill. Like any private citizen, of course, they have the right to proportionate self-defense, lethal if need be, but their professional role carries no right to kill. Since their professional vocation is to protect and promote the health of their patients, that's hardly surprising. Since at least the time of Hippocrates, physicians have been enjoined to do no harm, and this is an important precept, because physicians are allowed to occupy a position of considerable authority over their vulnerable human beings, human fellows, and doctors too are subject to temptations to abuse this authority, whether out of financial greed, or impatience with an expensive patient who simply won't finish dying, or the sheer pleasure of exercising the power of life or death over others. I'm thinking here of the infamous Dr. Harold Shipman, the English general practitioner who is reckoned to have killed about 250 of his patients before he was arrested in 1998. Shipman's case was, of course, mercifully rare, but it's not unique, and it serves to highlight the fact that we can presume moral integrity and humane commitment in the case of physicians no more than in the case of anyone else. Doctors too are human and therefore sinners. For these reasons, a doctor has no more right to kill than any other citizen. Nevertheless, given the purpose of their profession, to support fragile life and to remedy ill health and injury, doctors are more involved in making life and death decisions than most people. In deciding to abort a fetus, to withdraw support from a neonate, or to withhold treatment from an elderly patient, doctors do help to cause death. And they do so deliberately. Often they know that death will probably or certainly result from their decisions. Do they thereby kill their patients? Some would say they do, that to perform an act that one knows will result in death is tantamount to killing. Now, one can, of course, define killing broadly or narrowly. Broadly speaking, if I'm driving down a street and you walk straight out in front of my car, and I fail to brake in time, and you die as a result of my car hitting you, then you killed me. Then I killed you. My car wasn't driving itself. I was driving it when it hit you, so I caused your death. To cause something, however, is not yet to be responsible for it. I might have been having a heart attack at the time when you stepped out onto the road. And to be responsible for something is not yet to be culpable or blameworthy for it. I might have been driving well within the speed limit, but the immediacy with which you stepped out in front of my car made it impossible for me to brake fast enough. So causality, responsibility, and culpability are distinct. Let me illustrate these distinctions with a non-medical case. You'll recognize it if you've ever seen the swashbuckling film Master and Commander, where Russell Crowe stars as the captain of an 18th century Royal Navy ship. At one point, Crowe's ship is engulfed in a severe storm. One of the ship's masts is broken and crashes into the sea, sails, rigging and all. The midshipman warns the captain that unless the ship is cut free from the fallen mast, it will drag the ship over and cause it to sink, with the loss of hundreds of lives. The captain calls for a sailor to join him in bringing down axes onto the ropes connecting the ship to the wreckage. But there's a problem, because clinging to the wrecked mast is a sailor who was blown over with it, and if the ship is cut free from the mast, with a practical certainty, the sailor will drown. Nevertheless, the captain orders the sailor standing nearby to help him cut the ropes. The sailor happens to be the best friend of the fellow clinging to the wreckage, and as he lifts his axe and brings it down on the ropes, tears are streaming down his cheeks. The sailor with the axe knew what would happen with a practical certainty if he obeyed his captain's order. He knew that by cutting the wrecked mast free, his friend would drown. Nevertheless, in the full knowledge of what its effects would be, he chose to obey the order. Did he therefore intend to kill his friend? In a broad sense, yes, but not in a morally significant one. The sailor with the axe did not intend to kill his friend. His death was in no way part of the end or goal that he intended or wanted to achieve. The end he intended was to save the ship and its crew by the only means possible. The death of his friend was an unintended, unwanted side effect. However, to say that the sailor who brought down his axe on the rope did not intend the death of his friend is not to say that he wasn't responsible for it. He was responsible for it. He knew with a practical certainty that cutting the rope would result in his friend's death, and yet he proceeded to cut the rope anyway. But to be responsible is not yet to be culpable or blameworthy. So was he blameworthy? No, for two reasons. First, he did not intend or want his friend's death, and he helped to cause it only with appropriate reluctance. The tears streaming down his cheeks attest to that. Second, he deliberately accepted his friend's death for a proportionately strong reason, as the only way of saving the whole of the ship's company from drowning. The sailor with the axe did not intend death, but accepted it with due reluctance and for a proportionate reason. He was therefore not culpable. Now, this analysis, of course, introduces the controversial theory of double effect, which distinguishes between intended and unintended side effects. Utilitarian philosophers object to this distinction, arguing that what decides the rightness or wrongness of our actions are simply the results, and whether the good in them outweighs the evil. There's a lot to be said against utilitarianism, and now is not the time to say it. I shall confine myself to pointing out, first, that not all philosophers are utilitarian, that some very eminent philosophers are not, and that although the theory of double effect was first developed in Christian moral theology, it now finds support in moral philosophy. I'll also point out that the law commonly distinguishes cases of killing in terms of intention. Not all homicide is murder. We're now on section 4. To choose to act or not to act, knowing that a patient's death will probably or certainly result, is not yet to pursue that death as an end or goal, is not to intend death. In the strict sense, therefore, it's not to kill. In the strict sense, killing is intentional. So the fact that doctors are involved in making decisions to act or not to act, which result in the death of patients, does not mean that doctors are commonly involved in killing their patients. The morally decisive question is, to ask of any action or inaction, is, why did you do it, or why did you not do it? Why did you choose to perform an act or not to perform an act, knowing that the death of your patient would probably or certainly result? In cases of inaction or omission, was it because there was nothing effective you could have done to save the patient, because your action would have been futile? Or was it not so much that your action would have been futile as that the burdens it would have imposed on your patient would in some sense have outweighed its benefits? Or was it because the saving drug you could have administered you were not permitted to administer because the healthcare resources of a national health service were limited, and because the body responsible had decided that this drug was too expensive to supply? I know that's not your context, but it is mine. If any of these were the reasons why you chose to act or omit, and if your patient died as a result, it would not be appropriate to describe your action or inaction as killing in the narrow, strong, morally loaded sense. The morally decisive factor is not the result or effect or consequence of your action or inaction, it's the reason for your choice. And that reason could be one of medical efficacy. I didn't perform that treatment because it wouldn't have worked. Or it could be one of pastoral concern. I didn't perform that treatment because, while it would have worked, it would have made his life a permanent misery. Or it could be one of social justice. I didn't do it because our national healthcare resources aren't infinite, because we can't do everything for everybody, because it's been decided for good reasons that this kind of treatment should not be available to that kind of patient, and because it's fair. Let me make clear here that my point is not that inaction or omission can never be cases of intentional killing. If a child's drowning in a bath and I stand there with my arms folded until he becomes lifeless because I want him dead, I'm responsible and probably culpable for his death. And if you as a doctor withhold or withdraw treatment from your patient because you want him dead, and he consequently dies, you too are responsible and probably culpable for his death. We are responsible for whatever we choose to do or not to do, and being responsible, we have to give an account of our choice, and if our account fails to justify, we are culpable. The fact that I do nothing doesn't absolve me from responsibility or even blame. I can intend an end by permitting it to happen when I could have stopped it. Equally, I don't have to intend to kill in order to be culpable for a death. I can be blamed not only because I wanted you dead, but also because I didn't care enough to stop you being killed. That's to say, I can be guilty of culpable negligence. In the so-called covenant code of the ancient Hebrew scriptures, we are told that, quote, "When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. However, if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not restrained it, and it kills a man or woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death." Inaction can be culpably negligent as well as culpably intentional. Section 5. To withhold or withdraw treatment in the knowledge that your patient will die as a result need not be a case of killing your patient. It could be, however, if the reason for your inaction was that you intended his death. And even if you didn't positively intend his death, you could still be culpable of gross negligence for letting him die for no good reason. It all depends on why you acted or failed to act. This brings us to a question that I flirted with, but so far skirted around. Is it always morally wrong to intend to kill your patient? Could intentional killing by doctors ever be right? Well, here we enter morally dangerous territory. As I explained at the beginning of this lecture, a humanist political society that wants to recognize the high dignity of the lives of human individuals will minimize permissible killing of some citizens by others. And in the Christian West, such killing has been limited to private and proportionate self-defense and the publicly authorized maintenance of law and order. Some now argue, however, that permission for intentional killing should be extended to doctors in certain kinds of case. And in part they argue this on the ground that permission has already been extended in practice. How so? Well, it's now common for doctors to kill human fetuses intentionally by aborting them. And it's also common for them to withhold or withdraw treatment or support from neonates with the intention that they should die. Insofar as the objects of this intentional killing are living human beings, which they undoubtedly are, it should be a matter for serious moral concern in a humanist society. And insofar as the objects of killing pose no lethal threat to anyone, their being killed can't be described as a form of self-defense. One consideration that could mitigate our concern is that while the objects of killing are undoubtedly living human beings, they are, after all, the living offspring of human and not canine or feline parents. They're still not the kind of human beings that have the right not to be harmed, except in self-defense or in punishment. We could say that this human being is not yet a person, that is, not yet a center of subjectivity. Now, although drawing such a distinction is controversial, of course, and considerable objections can be levelled against it, it seems to me not unreasonable. And here I should just say, I'm not a conservative Roman Catholic. I'm not a conservative on this point evangelical. So on this point I am, relative to some Christians, liberal. For all the continuities between a zygote and the adult person that it will eventually become, there is also a significant difference. The zygote does not yet possess the basic physical precondition of subjectivity, namely a functioning brain. So it seems to me that it wouldn't be unreasonable for a humanist society to say that the right not to be harmed except in self-defense and in punishment does not extend to living human beings before a certain stage of cerebral development. What that stage should be would be controversial, since reasons can be given in favour of different ones. But whatever the decision, it wouldn't be an expression of carelessness about human dignity. The intentional killing of neonates, however, is more problematic. To kill a neonate intentionally is not to let it die because treatment would be futile or unjust or simply an unreasonable expenditure of finite resources. It's to kill it with the intention that it should die. What might the reason for that intention be? It could be that the neonate is anencephalic, lacking a functioning brain, and so is not and never could become a human subject or person. Such a case of killing would arguably not be morally wrong. Alternatively, the reason could be some deformity or handicap other than anencephaly. If so, that lands us on very dangerous territory, because it involves some persons deciding that the life of another person is not worth sustaining. It involves the intentional abandonment of a fellow person to death. Now, such killing need not amount to infanticide at another's whim if the judgment about a worthwhile life is a reasonable guesstimate of what the neonate would judge itself, if it could. However, while such an estimate might be well-meaning, it's still morally hazardous. And this is because the criteria of worthwhile life attributed to the neonate can easily reflect the prejudices of their able-bodied parent or doctor and the limits of their sympathetic imagination and of their patience and courage. So, for example, speaking for myself as someone who has enjoyed well-nigh perfect health the whole of his life, I find it very hard to imagine how severely handicapped people can tolerate living under their constraints. But they evidently do. They evidently do. And my lack of imagination merely reflects the limits of my own experience and the fact that, not having had to cope with the challenge of such constraints myself, I've never had to develop the necessary virtues to make something of them. There are good reasons why a humanist society that would exalt the dignity of human persons will not generally put the lives of some at the mercy of others' judgments of worthwhileness. The first is that different individuals can lead significant lives in very different and sometimes very adverse circumstances. And the second is that our judgments about others can be blinkered and even malevolent and negligent. Therefore, I think that doctors' intentional killing of neonate persons on the ground that their lives aren't worth sustaining is morally dubious. Section 6. One reason for intentional killing by doctors is that the life taken is not worth keeping. Another is that the one to be killed wants to die. And this brings us to the questions of physician-assisted suicide, PAS, and voluntary euthanasia. The discussion typically begins with cases of terminally ill patients whose intolerable physical suffering can't be relieved by normal palliative means and who are therefore asked to die. Surely, proponents of the legalization of PAS and euthanasia argue doctors should be permitted at least to give such patients the means for an efficient suicide. Now, PAS does have the signal merit of not involving doctors in the intentional killing of their patients. In PAS, it is the patient who does the killing, not the doctor. Nevertheless, PAS could be morally dubious if in committing suicide the patient were to underestimate the value of her own life. But if intolerable and irremediable physical suffering and terminal illness are imposed as conditions, then the likelihood of that becomes much reduced. We can all imagine, I suggest, circumstances so grim and hopeless that prolonging the struggle to survive doesn't seem to make much sense. However, there are reason to doubt that the conditions of eligibility for PAS can be kept so stringent. One reason is that if the law permitting PAS enshrines the principle that intolerable and irremediable suffering is a sufficient ground of eligibility, then it will be quickly pointed out that such suffering need not be physical at all and is not confined to the terminally ill. Thus, among the cases that the British media have recently paraded in favour of PAS has been one of an octogenarian who did not want to soldier on after the death of his wife, and another of a 23-year-old tetraplegic former rugby player who, according to his parents, quote, was not prepared to live what he felt was a second-class existence. Another reason to doubt that PAS can be restricted to the terminally ill who are suffering intolerably is that the case for it is increasingly made in terms not of intolerable suffering, but of autonomy. And the logic of that, I think, is to press for no restrictions at all except rational competence, and so an age limit, let's say, of 18. My concerns about this slippery slope toward PAS on demand have been confirmed by the direction of public deliberation in the Netherlands, where being tired of life is now under consideration as a ground for claiming a right to PAS. But I am aware that the state of Oregon here in the US is a potential fly in the ointment of my argument, since as far as I know, there has been no pressure there for a relaxation of the conditions of eligibility. Still, whatever its problems, PAS does not involve doctors in intentional killing. Euthanasia, on the other hand, does. In conducting voluntary euthanasia, the doctor kills a patient with his consent. Need that always be morally wrong? The condition of the patient's consent ensures, at least in principle, that it's the patient who judges whether his life is worth persevering with, not the doctor. And surely the doctor's motive can be compassion, not malevolence or carelessness. So what's the problem? Well, with a view to seeing what the problem might be, let's compare two classic English cases. The first is that of Dr. David Moore, who was tried in 1999 for murdering one of his elderly patients, who was dying from cancer. And he did this by injecting a fatal dose of diamorphine. Dr. Moore denied the charge, claiming that he administered the drug to ease pain, not to shorten life. The trial judge directed the jury that they had to decide whether Dr. Moore was trying to ease pain or whether he'd set out to end his patient's life. The jury acquitted him. The second case is that of Dr. Nigel Cox. One of his elderly female patients was dying from rheumatoid arthritis. She was in considerable pain and pleaded with Dr. Cox to end her life. He injected her with potassium chloride, and she died minutes later. Dr. Cox was charged with attempted murder rather than murder because it wasn't possible to prove that the potassium chloride had actually caused the victim's death, since her corpse had been cremated. During the trial in 1992, the judge directed the jury that it was common ground that potassium chloride has no curative properties and is not used to relieve pain, that injected into a vein it is lethal, that one ampoule would certainly kill, and that Dr. Cox had injected two. Dr. Cox was convicted. Now, what distinguishes the cases? Both patients were dying, both in considerable pain. We're told that Dr. Cox's patient consented to his action. I think we can assume that Dr. Moore's consented to his too. Let's give Dr. Cox benefit of doubt and assume that what he did, at least in part, out of compassion, in which case both he and Dr. Moore share the same virtuous motive. In both cases, the patient dies as a consequence of the doctor's action. So what are the differences? First, Dr. Moore administered diamorphine, which is suitable for pain relief. Dr. Cox administered potassium chloride, which has no palliative properties. Second, if we may assume that Dr. Moore's dose of diamorphine, though in fact lethal, was proportioned to his patient's distress, we may infer that his intention was, as he claimed, to relieve pain, not to kill. And if we may assume that Dr. Cox could have availed himself of an analgesic drug, then we may infer from his choice of potassium chloride that he intended to kill his patient. We may also infer that he wanted his deed to make it an unambiguous public statement, since he could have chosen to do it more obliquely by way of an analgesic overdose. So in fact, Dr. Cox had two motives: compassion for his patient and a resolve to assert the rectitude of intentional killing in such circumstances. So what could be wrong with Dr. Cox's intentional killing? One possibility is that doctors should not use the treatment of their patients to make political points. The more considerable possibility is that while we can assume honourable motives in the particular case of Dr. Cox, it would nevertheless be imprudent, dangerous, to let doctors become generally accustomed to intending the death of their patients. The appropriate response to the suffering of patients is that doctors should intend pain relief. That should surely be their overriding intention. Now, in certain extreme circumstances, let's say on the battlefield, it might be the case that the only available means of pain relief is a bullet in the head. But in peacetime America and England, far less morally ambiguous palliative means are widely available, and so long as that is so, they're the ones that should be used. Should doctors ever kill their patients? In sum, what I think is this. In many cases, doctors can't avoid making decisions that they know will cause their patients to die, but to do something deliberately that will have a known effect does not amount to intending that effect. To intend death is to make death the purpose or goal of what you do. Is it always wrong for a doctor to intend a patient's death? Not if the patient is arguably not a person, but if the patient is arguably a person, then no doctor should intend to kill him. I've been rushing all that. I've been talking faster than I would normally do because there is time, but also because having finished the text of my paper last week, I then thought about the last statement more carefully this morning. So here's a 3-minute addition. Okay. The problem of extremely premature neonates who have a prospect of life full of chronic pain and suffering. Is it not doing a favour to kill such a neonate? This is a very difficult case, and I think the answer depends on the nature of the suffering. I'm not sure how to answer this. First of all, I'd say that human beings do live and can flourish in chronic pain. I've learned from my wife that pain is not absolute. It depends on a variety of circumstances, some of them psychological. And pain becomes more tolerable if life is meaningful, and life is meaningful if you're loved. Nevertheless, I can imagine extreme cases where life is consumed with pain to the extent that there's nothing left in life except the experience of pain, and where there's no prospect of relief. That's to say, there might be cases of neonates analogous to that of the hackneyed soldier trapped in the vehicle burning to death. I can think of one historical example where this was the case, and where where soldiers were trapped in a burning train car, and their officer went along the line shooting them dead. Now, it's an extreme case, but I have to say, I think he was a hero, the officer. So are there cases of neonates that are analogous to that? Well, I don't know, but let's suppose there are. What should we do? Well, my preference would be, in order to maintain my hard line against intentional killing, my preference would be palliative sedation, permanent if need be. But if that doesn't make medical sense, and you'll have to tell me if it doesn't make medical sense, then we have a case where effective pain relief and death are practically indistinguishable, where intentional killing, that is to say, where intentional killing may be the only effective means of pain relief. Now, this is dangerous territory, because if you concede the principle, all sorts of things can start to slide. But I wonder whether here is an exception that needs to be made to my absolute prohibition of intentional killing. Maybe this is a case, a medical equivalent of the bullet in the head. So I'll leave you with that problem, the problem for me at least. Thanks.
Thank Professor Biggar for his good remarks on an important topic. In just a few minutes, I wish to engage and to extend his analysis by requesting 2 points of clarification and by offering an observation about the way that these questions relate or could relate to medical professionalism. So first, request for clarification. First, the term person does significant work in Dr. Biggar's paper, as it does in our modern political landscape, in defining a class of those whose death ought never to be intended. But I wonder if the concept of person, particularly in Christian context, might be expanded into something more than center of subjectivity, as Dr. Biggar describes it, particularly as that alone would seem to confer questionable status not only on those at the beginning of life, as has been talked about in this talk, but also on those whose capacity for distinctively human subjectivity, perhaps through brain injury or advanced dementia, has been partially or totally lost. I think here, for example, about St. Thomas Aquinas, who clearly recognized cases of profound mental impairment in his 13th century context, but who assiduously avoided any possibility that this impairment could be used as a basis for euthanasia, going so far as to hold that profoundly disabled persons, those whom he referred to as the amens, should be baptized and included in Christian community, not on account of their own enacted faith, but in the faith of the Church, and who as such have the habit of wisdom, even if they cannot display it on account of bodily indisposition. Might it be possible then, for example, to distinguish, say, between ontological and subjective personhood, or perhaps better yet, to find a way other than subjectivity to account for those whose death ought never to be intended? Second, the paper hints that killing an anencephalic infant by commission or omission arguably would not be morally wrong. And yet, acknowledging that blurry situations exist, the vast majority of modern cases in which neonates of any sort are allowed to die would seem to be those in which treatment is unlikely to be of benefit. Anencephaly with open cranium, to take the example given, is a uniformly fatal condition, and so any care offered beyond basic supportive care would seem to have little possibility of long-term gain. To clarify then, are there any cases in which it would be morally appropriate for a physician to act with the knowledge that death will result in the absence of what we might call futility or unjust allocation of resources? And you've talked about one potential case at the very end of your talk. Finally, to add to what Dr. Biggar has said, a brief note about the sorts of assumptions which are put on display within public discourse on physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Debate about physician-assisted death in a culture in which physicians have been granted custody of various forms of potentially life-ending technology often forces attention to the question of whether physicians, as physicians, have any more determinative commitments than to provide the medical goods and services which their patients ask for after discussing various options. The modern presumption that physicians are servants of patient autonomy, particularly when patients are suffering and want to relieve suffering, forces the need to justify the collective withholding of, say, high-dose barbiturates to a suicidal person. In the face of an ethic of unlimited autonomy, such withholding seems kind of arbitrary. But there's another possible approach to this, which is simply to hold that killing patients or intentionally providing means for suicide is just not the sort of thing which physicians or other health professionals do. That just as physicians do not perform executions or assist in military torture practices, as has been an issue within my own field of psychiatry, neither do physicians act as agents of death for patients who request this of them. The degree to which physicians feel discomfort with physician-assisted death, or if not that, with other things like the provision of, say, enhancement technologies of various sorts, shows the degree to which this older model of medical professionalism still has a hold on us. And in my mind, this is not a bad thing, even if it rouses the dreaded charge of paternalism. But it does force us, as individuals, those of us who are health professionals, and as a profession, to think critically about the sorts of moral commitments which do inform our practice. Because while physician paternalism might have its dangers, it's far more dangerous still to believe that one is ethically neutral, while all the while displaying operative moral commitments that, because they can't be named, can't be defended either. My view is that physicians do have determinative moral commitments, which are effaced neither by attention to patient autonomy nor by the myth of scientific neutrality. And this is, in general, a good thing. But we do better to name and to own our operative commitments than in a rush to concede to patient autonomy to pretend that they don't exist.
I'd also like
Thanks.
to thank you for your comments, particularly the coda at the end, which I wish I'd had a little more time to think about, because I think some of my comments anticipate some of the things that you begin to explore there. I have, first, I suppose, a suggestion, and then a deliberate question, then a larger comment. The first suggestion, this sort of picks up to some degree with what Warren was talking about regarding the work that personhood does for you, or subjectivity does, is that with your focus on the neonate and the fetuses, I'm a general surgeon and I deal with adult patients, and it doesn't take long for me to come into circumstances where physicians are involved in killing of some variety by omission or commission, or at least getting on that gray line. And it seems to me that the case of surgically installed feeding tubes might be the kind of clinical scenario where the patient is a person by any definition, by and large, yet the removing or withholding of that technology, or the mandatory insertion of it, as the shifting position of the Vatican now seems to make morally obligatory for the reasons that it's seen now to be ordinary care, might be something that would sort of sharpen the argument a little bit. The question that I have is that, though I agree with you that the warrant of lives not worth living is morally dubious to justify killing, I was really intrigued by your suggestion that there's a category of kinds of justification that would include pastoral concern. And I'm not sure that many clinicians sort of style themselves as having pastoral concerns, though as a physician who happens to also be a priest, I think you may be onto something there. But I'm wondering whether you have an example, and perhaps your coda is one, where a pastoral concern in medicine might be a less dubious kind of justification for physician killing. And then my primary point, which takes a little bit of work to get to, is basically that it seems to me that your argument is not particularly Christian. It may have been intended to be so. It's humanist, for sure. It has a high view of personhood that is thus consistent with large parts of the Christian witness. But just to the extent that you presume that suffering ought properly to be eliminated by technically efficient medical intervention, and just to the extent that you also assume that by and large autonomous choices about bodies ought to be honored, though perhaps not in an absolute way, it seems to me that some of the most important aspects of the Christian witness in this regard are ignored. In other words, by ceding the anthropology of humanism, I think that you've given up too much and perhaps abandoned your biblical birthright. So to explain what I mean, I need to make a few seemingly unrelated remarks that I hope will cohere at the end. First, I'm a good Anglican, and thus I begin with lex orandi, lex credendi, prayer shaping believing. And as I'm sure you know, the great litany of the Church, prayed even now at the beginning of Advent and Lent, includes the petition, "Good Lord, deliver us from dying suddenly and unprepared," which of course is precisely the way that most modern Americans want to die, even the Christians among us. So much has changed since the great litany was written, even within the Church, with regard to what might be considered a good death. The litany is based on the assumption that people would want to put their life in order before meeting their Maker. And by way of contrast, the modern notion generally views a good death as one in which the dying patient is made to be unaware that he or she is actually dying. Now, I recognize that not all palliative medicine is practiced in this way, and in fact, I think it's less and less common. But my suspicion is, based in my own experience of watching this happen, is that the imperative to narcotize dying patients to the point of unconsciousness has more often to do with the discomfort of those attending the death than the discomfort of the person who's actually dying. And that brings me to my second point, that in the United States, I don't know whether this is the case in Britain as well, that a fully trained physician is given the honorific title of the attending physician. And I haven't done a formal etymological analysis of this usage, but I suspect that it arose before the advent of modern and technologically efficient medicine. I suspect it arose at a time in which most of what physicians could do was merely attend to the sick and their suffering, to walk with them through their illness, to witness their tribulation and offer compassionate support. So the usage of attending physicians persists, but I want to suggest that much of our current debate about physician killing is shaped by the fact that the kind of people who excel at technologically efficient medicine are not necessarily the kind of people who excel at attending to other people's suffering. The kinds of people that we're recruiting into medicine are not necessarily the kind of people who excel at attending other people's suffering. And thus the physician's focus of late has shifted from attending to an emphasis on efficient elimination of that suffering. Modern patients and modern physicians are equally alike in their discomfort with attending to those who do not die suddenly and unprepared. Third, I recognize your desire to avoid revelation as an explicit source of authority in your argument, yet I think that reasonable Christians such as ourselves, you and I, can build more compelling arguments if we first posit some grounding principles that inform and shape our position. These principles may be rooted in revelation or speculative theology, and as such they aren't empirically provable, yet as you plan to argue tomorrow night, they are nonetheless reasonable. And with regard to physician killing, I think that it is essential to point out that the humanist anthropology that views the human condition as essentially autonomous, independent, and rational has no greater epistemic warrant than other rival anthropologies, including a more traditional Christian one. Anthropologies can't be proven empirically, but different anthropologies may in fact lead to substantially different conclusions about physician killing. So in that regard, I want to suggest that the starting place for a Christian approach to physician killing begins with an anthropological foundation that recognizes that first, our bodies are not our own, they've been bought with a price by Christ Jesus. And second, that, and this is perhaps more importantly, that suffering is somehow constitutive to the human condition. Rather than eliminating suffering efficiently, the Christian God chooses to enter into that suffering. Thus, a Christian approach to physician killing has to contend with the mysterious fact, and I think this is empirically demonstrable, that deep down at the center of the human condition, suffering is. So the Christian physician who begins with this anthropology, the Christian physician who recognizes that the human condition is to suffer and not be in control of our bodies, that kind of physician is more likely to develop the virtues necessary to attend the dying. That kind of physician is likely to facilitate a different kind of good death that is something other than suddenly and unprepared. And that kind of death is going to demand the kind of response offered by people like Therese Schroeder-Schecker, who some of you may have heard of, who for 20 years has practiced a discipline she calls music thanatology. Her discipline began while she was working at a nursing home, and when confronted with the unconsolable grief of a demented elderly woman, she responded by climbing into bed with her, embracing her body, and beginning to sing Gregorian chant. And then she went and discovered that in the customaries of monasteries of Europe, there was always the place for the harp in the infirmary. So now for 20 years, she's developed an on-call service that when people are suffering from unconsolable pain, or unrelievable pain, or haven't slept for a long time, or in the active process of dying, they call Therese, and she shows up with a student in tow, and after unpacking their harps, they begin to play music, which is based at the same tempo of the heart rate and the respiratory rate. And as they slow the tempo down, the heart rate and the respiratory rate slows down, and people who haven't slept in weeks sleep. Those who have had unremitting pain are relieved. And those who are dying wake up and look into the eyes of their loved ones as quite literally they are sung to their last rest on the wings of angels. So the possibility of that kind of response to suffering is the best reason I know for grounding the absolute prescription against physician killing, or at least the absolute prescription for Christian physicians to avoid killing. And I suspect that you agree with a lot of what I've said, but I'm wondering whether you can explain a bit about why you chose to take the tack that you did, that was more secular in its humanism than fully embracing an anthropology and a language that is more distinctively Christian.
Yep. So we've got 3 minutes. Is that right? Right. Well, first of all, thank you both very much, and forgive me if I don't give thorough answers to your questions, because I've now got 2.5 minutes. Okay. First of all, on this distinguishing the human from the personal, I think it's necessary to give an account of why we treat humans different from slugs or dogs. So what is it about the human that requires us to be more careful? And whatever those qualities are what I would call personal. Much hangs, to my mind, upon how you fill out those qualities. So if you define a person as someone capable of rationality, and then you think of rationality as liberal philosophers tend to, in terms of one's capacity to run projects, to be venturesome and assertive, well, then you begin to degrade the status of the severely disabled child, who is capable never in his life of launching projects or of generating a biography full of exciting events. So I prefer to think of what constitutes personhood as a capacity for some kind of responsibility, so that even a severely disabled child whose face lights up when you turn Mozart on, who is able to respond to goods in the world in even a very inarticulate fashion, that is sufficient, as far as I'm concerned, for personhood. And in making a distinction between the human and the personal, it is dangerous, because the danger is you end up denying human beings the kind of care we would normally expect to give them. And if we can possibly avoid that, I would. But I just wonder in certain extreme cases whether that makes sense. So in the case of Tony Bland, the football supporter who was crushed in Liverpool in the 1980s, and who was on life support, and whose cortex had turned to water. I mean, does it make sense to keep him alive? Anyway, if indeed it's true that of course there is no effective treatment for anencephaly, then the reason that you withhold treatment is simply that futility. Well, that would be fine as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I hope I made clear my desire is to try and hold the line on no intentional killing. What I'm bothered about are certain extreme cases and whether that can be done consistently. As for autonomy, both of you have, well, you raised that first, Warren. Yeah, I'm not a fan of autonomy. I'm a Christian. That's to say, yes, of course, I recognise human beings should exercise their consciences, and we all recognise there's certain times of life where we ought to have freedom to decide what to do, but I don't believe in absolute autonomy, and I believe human beings are bound by social obligations, and I believe it's better that we meet those obligations than not, even if it costs us. Now, moving swiftly on to Dan's points. I'm a bit stung by the notion that I didn't come across as Christian, because I think of myself as being a Christian moral theologian. So we'll have to talk about this further over dinner. But let me just say that, first of all, that one can be Christian without always being distinctive. That's to say, a Christian alongside an Orthodox Jew or a Muslim or even an atheist humanist will affirm something about human dignity. Now, that's not distinctively Christian, but it is Christian, and there are other people who don't affirm that. So the fact that I as a Christian overlap with others or have allies, it doesn't bother me. I hope that I will be distinctively Christian at the right points, but I don't care to be distinctive all the time. So my concern is whether I think I was being Christian. There may have been more I could have said. Now, I don't in fact think that suffering always ought to be eliminated, and it seems to me that pointless suffering should be eliminated if we can and if we may. But there may be cases where someone is suffering, but the only means of relieving them would, for example, diminish a societal commitment to human dignity. And one might say that such a person has a social obligation to suffer, because the only ways of relieving them would actually cause widespread social harm. So I don't think of patient autonomy or the elimination of suffering is unqualified at all. And I think there are some times when we just have to suffer, sometimes directly or indirectly for the sake of other people. I think I'd better stop there for the time being.
For those of you who need to leave for clinical responsibilities or such, please do so. We will take 2 questions, and then please, if you're available, tomorrow evening, 7 p.m., our guests will join us again in Geffen Auditorium at 7 p.m. We'll have much more time for questions and interaction at that point, given no time constraints. So we'll take 2 questions before we have to wrap up, unfortunately.
It may be a matter of semantics, but my background was in rehabilitation medicine. And one of the things that we deal with, particularly patients with spinal injuries, is quality of life. And I never heard any words like that, or at least I didn't understand. And I wonder if you would comment on the value of quality of life in your decision making.
Yeah, it's an area I find difficult because, particularly when it comes to making life or death decisions, and saying of someone, this person's life is not worth sustaining. Now, it's different from saying there's no way we can sustain this life, or there's no way we can treat effectively. But I just think we're getting on dangerous territory when we have to make judgments about whether someone's life is worth sustaining. I mean, I can think of extreme cases where if someone's life is going to be entirely consumed by pain and distress until they actually die, it's not clear to me why we should sustain this life. But I just think it's, in life or death decisions, it's dangerous. But you may come back to me and say, well, it may be dangerous, but it's inevitable. We have to make those decisions.
Maybe we'll continue this conversation afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's how I respond. Yeah. So I wasn't. Yes, I was thinking more in terms of worthwhileness of life. You use the term quality. That worthwhileness is what I was referring to. Yeah.
I had a question on your point with physician-assisted suicide. You were talking about how, in this case, the physician's not intending to do it. So sure, he is acting, so responsible in a way, but maybe not blameworthy. I'd like to follow your thought there. And I guess I just was wondering if you would then say that it is a morally permissible act, just because I guess I'm not quite following how it is covered possibly by the principle of double effect then, because even if he's not intending, it seems like the end here is still not good if it's death. Or would you say that the end is good, if you were to define, because that is what the patient wishes?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm a little confused on, how you perceive.
Right. My view of PAS at the moment is in Britain we haven't legalised PAS, and I oppose legalisation for a number of reasons I don't have time to explain here. All I wanted to say there was that if you have to choose between PAS and voluntary euthanasia, then PAS is preferable insofar as doctors don't do the killing, and I want to hold the line as far as possible and say doctors should not intend to kill. Now, of course, in aiding someone to commit suicide, you're aiding them, so you're responsible for that. That doesn't commit you to wanting to do it, and it certainly doesn't. You may well not be aiding them because you want them dead.
I guess my question is, though, it's not covered, though. Is it covered by principle of double effect here in this case? Could you apply it?
P.S.
It seems like the end. Like, how would you, I guess, kind of classify the end? Because I feel like that's kind of a core point with the principle of double effect. If the end is good for a greater good.
I guess I wouldn't try and analyse what the doctor is doing in terms of double effect there. But your question provokes me to think about, well, how would I describe it? I guess what's important is it's not intentional killing. That's what's important. Whether you can give a good enough account of what the doctor is doing anyway is, I have to think about that.
And then if it's not intentional killing, would you say it's morally permissible still then?
No, I wouldn't, because the argument I've made elsewhere is that it seems to me as soon as you legalise PAS, because Oregon's case goes against this view, but as soon as you legalise PAS, sooner or later someone's going to say, well, what about people who are terminally ill and suffering equally, but who can't do it themselves? In fact, that's already been raised in Oregon, in the case of patients who are competent to request PAS but can't swallow the lethal medication. So what do you do with them? So it's already raised. So, and then when you say, well, okay, so we'll allow voluntary euthanasia for terminally ill, unbearable suffering. But unbearable suffering isn't just physical; it's also mental. And so in the Netherlands, a 50-year-old woman who was in deep grief at the death of her two sons was judge eligible for PAS because she was in unbearable suffering. And I guess I see logically it, and then in societies like ours, who are doctors to tell patients what's unbearable? And so the logic is, if you want it and you're over 18 and you're not insane, here you are. And that seems to me that the logic leads to a place where we have no objective commitment to human dignity, and then I think we're in deep trouble. So I guess I see that kind of slippery slope, and I want to stop it at the top. So that's why I'm opposed to PAS. But it's as far as intentional killing by doctors is concerned, it's less morally problematic than euthanasia. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.